Upon arrival in Canada, President Lee Jae-myung dove right into his sideline diplomatic engagements, sitting down separately with his counterparts from South Africa and Australia. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective for June 17th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. President Lee Jae-myung is in Canada for the extended Group of 7 session, during which artificial intelligence and energy supply chains will be addressed. For more on this session, as well as the Press and Sideline summits, I have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24 here in the studio. Chloe, welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I also have freelance journalist Yang Chien-Hao from Taiwan, currently based here in Seoul with us. Chien-Hao, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Hello, glad to be here.
Chloe, upon arrival in Canada for the extended G7 session, President Lee Jae-myung sat down separately with his counterparts from South Africa and Australia. Let's begin with details from those bilateral engagements.
Yeah, so he decided to, that was known on the program, that yesterday would be bilateral engagement with countries that are not member of the G7 and that were also invited, just like South Korea. And today we're supposed to be, we'll talk a bit more about that later on, but we're supposed to be bilateral and trilateral talks with the member of the G7. He spoke mostly, so with South Africa, he was speaking mostly about economical partnerships and trying to, renew the links that have been kind of severed in the last 6 months because diplomacy was kind of at a stop in South Korea. With Australia, he talked mostly about, sorry, I'm searching in my notes again. Yeah, he was speaking about the North Korean nuclear threat, sorry about that, with Australia. So that was more on the security side, which is also one of the main points of main theme that is to be developed in this G7 summit. It was peace and security that's supposed to be discussed. So the other thing that were supposed to be done for the first diplomatic steps of President Lee Jae-myung were supposed to meet with Donald Trump. Unfortunately, President Trump had to leave earlier. He explained that yesterday night he was going to leave. So we know now that this bilateral meeting is not going to happen this time. We don't know yet who the President Lee Jae-myung is going to meet today. They will talk about meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan. That could have been a trilateral talks because obviously the three allies are quite close and there is a need for Lee Jae-myung to be able to meet the two counterparts in the US and Japan. It will also be a way for him to show South Korean trustworthiness on the diplomatic scene. Lee Jae-myung during the campaign has been speaking about pragmatic diplomacy. That was the kind of thing that has been discussed and maybe a bit critiqued by pundits. And so there is a need to show also that the Korean democracy, and I'm going to quote there the presidential office, that the fact that the Korean democracy has survived the crisis posed by the martial law declaration. So to show that Korea is back and is a trustworthy partner and that the other countries can come back to discussing and making partnerships with South Korea.
Right, and staying with President Lee Jae-myung's agenda at the G7, during the extended G7 meeting, he will partake in talks on AI and clean energy. What more can you share with us about that particular agenda?
So in the previous broadcast, we've mentioned that President Lee has been focusing and emphasizing his plans and goals of strengthening South Korea's ability on developing and using the AI, also hoping to boost the economy, especially the rural area, through developing clean and renewable energy. That's what we have discussed after he's been elected. And as we know so far, that President Lee is scheduled to speak maybe twice on the topics of diversifying the energy supply chain and integrating AI with energy systems. And in the future, we might see that the new government might increasing more spending on developing AI techniques and also cultivating relevant talents and probably trying to find a more clear connection and plan to connect AI, clean energy, and economic development all together, also strengthening cooperations with United States and the European Union in the same field. Since it's a majority government now, for President Lee, with the Democratic Party controlling the National Assembly, pushing related legislation and putting more budget on such fields will be way more easy now. But challenges do exist. It's not going to be that easy, especially when dealing with energy. I'm going to talk more about it, having details later.
Right, indeed. Chloe, in recent years, such talks like such multilateral platforms involving global leaders have also taken up the topic of sustainable economic advances. That being said, often linking that, of course, to climate action. What are your prospects with regard to talk on climate action, especially keeping in mind Mr. Trump's rejection of climate science, if you will?
Yeah, so in this G7, because it's happening in Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister decided that there should be a discussion to improve joint responses to wildfires. So wildfires is a very impactful and strong consequences of climate change. It has been impacting all the countries that are currently working at the G7. I'm speaking especially here in South Korea. We had recently very strong and devastating, dramatic wildfires. So this was to be discussed yesterday. It's an important topic also for the Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister. And it's interesting to see some of the Canadian medias, especially like the Calgary Herald, has been saying that it's interesting to see that the G7 leaders, when discussing climate change, chose the end-on approach to speak about a very specific topic with the US and the US of Donald Trump especially, rather than going on climate change subject. They decided to speak about wildfires and not about the general theme, because we do know that Donald Trump is a climate change skeptic. He has been choosing to go on anti-climate improvement measures. I'm thinking, for example, withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement. He done it for his first mandate. He just done it again on this second mandate. So that is a very strong message from him, saying that it's not climate change for him is not the most important thing. And we can, for example, see on May 22, the G7 head of finance gathered, and in their common joint declaration, there were no mention of climate change. And that's something that has to be seen. So in my opinion, I would say, because there is this need to make sure that the US will sign the final declaration, we cannot expect much to be done. And the problem is with climate change, lots should be done. So it might be not enough, and the US has to be included in any measures, because they are anyway one of the biggest greenhouse gases producers. So if they're not there, most of the plans are not going to work anyway.
Right. Meanwhile, Chien-Hao, Bloomberg recently published an article about President Lee Jae-myung's role in advancing Korea's policy with regard to the environment. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I will need to point out first one thing which many people might not know, that the Korea Electric Power Corporation, the KEPCO, is indeed in a very critical situation now. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, the KEPCO had been running deficits for 3 consecutive years, only returning to profitability last year. However, it's still carrying a massive debt of 34.7 trillion won, which is a really huge amount. And KEPCO relies too much on the subsidies from the government, but meanwhile it has made little effort to invest in renewable or clean energy recent years. As a result, South Korea's renewable energy infrastructure and development remain significantly in a very, very low level. So when talking about renewable energy, we always think of for example, solar or wind energy, right? But due to South Korea's geographical limitations, as we know that there are so many mountains, and even in the plains, it is so densely populated, so many people. So there is limited land available for building solar or wind power facilities indeed. And during President Moon Jae-in's period, his term, facing the influx of low-cost Chinese equipment threatening South Korean manufacturers. Indeed, the South Korean government introduced a tracking and certification system requiring the domestic solar developers to verify the carbon footprint of solar panels throughout their supply chains. This policy leads South Korea's solar module prices become the highest in the world, making solar energy investment become more difficult. Nobody want to invest on it. Also, when we always think that the eastern area of South Korea is generally considered as an ideal area for developing renewable energy. However, during President Yoon Suk-yeol's period, the government restricted the issuance of power generation permits in the region until 2032, citing the need to upgrade local substations. So this has resulted in 60% of the South Korea's electricity, 60% still coming from fossil fuels. So President Lee Jae-myung now faces an extremely daunting or very difficult challenge. He must replan and invest in renewable energy infrastructure and effort that usually have no immediate results and often takes decades to bear fruit. Moreover, renewable energy requires high upfront costs, making it politically unrewarding. However, if President Lee fails to act swiftly, fails to act faster, it will become even more difficult for South Korea to develop renewable energy in the future. South Korea will grow incredibly dependent on fossil fuels and nuclear power. Both will cause heavy burden on the environment. So the country would also miss the key opportunity or the key chance to use renewable energy as a tool to improve its economic structure.
Right. Well, perhaps fully aware of these challenges, Chloe, President Lee Jae-myung has spoken about setting up a new ministry, so-called the Climate Energy Ministry. Now, I understand the French government itself has been quite active with regard to addressing climate concerns and advancing clean energy. The Environment Ministry in France, I believe, was named the Ecological Transition Ministry back in the year 2020. And then just last year, the name was made even longer. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular ministry and the achievements it's marked thus far?
Yeah, sure. So to get the full name just once, because we don't have enough time to use it all the time, it's not the Ministry of Ecological Transition, Energy, Climate and Risk Prevention. So just to speak about the name, because in France it's the decision of the Prime Minister and the President to choose the names of the ministers and choose their level in the protocolar order. So that's always say something. So the fact that they changed the name shows that they want to reflect the importance of taking into account climate change, but also risk prevention. Once again, we're coming back to the first question on wildfires. So showing that there is a link between climate change, the need for transition in ecology, and the risk that are happening in all of different ways. France is not touched that much by wildfires, but there are other big meteorological events that happen and that are quite strong for France. For example, floods do happen a lot as well. So this is interesting to see that this ministry in general, let's not speak about the very specific long one now, but in the recent years, there have been a betterment of air quality in France. So they've been trying to work. They've been also working on a stronger norm on overfishing in the French waters. For the most part of the politics on environment, it's true that because we're part of the European Union, a lot of things are coming from the European Union and then implemented in France. France is unfortunately still a bit slow in some effects. They're just beginning of this week, France has shown a new plan to try to reduce the quantity of plastic waste. We are one of the last in the European Union, so there are still things to be made. I feel like this is something that is seen and taken in account by this Ministry of Ecological Transition. But I would say, in reality, there has been a downgrade in the question of ecological transition in France, at least if we take just for the 2 mandates of President Emmanuel Macron. When he started in 2017, the Ministry of Environment at the time was number 2 in the protocolar order in the government. So it was quite a strong position for the first days of the mandate. Currently, the new minister is number 12. So it has been downgrading. Obviously, because there is a downgrade, there's also downgrade in budget. So there is this idea that maybe the government is not taking that much attention into the environment, but I would say it's probably reflective of the global state of the world. Again, coming back to the G7 summit, I feel like, unfortunately, right now, because of all that's going on in the geopolitical order, I feel like ecology is the part that is suffering the most, because the attention is going to something else, and that could be peace, that could be stability, that could be economy. So obviously the focus cannot be on everything at once. I do feel that in a lot of countries, this is environment and ecology is the one who's taking the most, like losing the focus.
Right. And back with regard to the Group of 7 summit over in Canada, Chien-Hao, there's been quite a bit of talk about expanding the membership of the Group of 7 to include countries like South Korea and even Australia. What's the latest on that front?
Remember, it used to be G8, right? But Russia was being excluded 2014 after invaded the Crimea. And South Korea, though, had been invited into the expand G7 session several times, but also still not an official member till now. And when talking about G7, there are United States and United Kingdom and Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japan is the only Asian country among the G7. And indeed, recently, there are some scholars and even think tanks suggesting that the membership of G7 should be reconsidered, perhaps by including countries like you mentioned, Australia or even South Korea, and expanding it into maybe G9. Which could be an ideal plan. The influence of the current G7 countries is indeed going down. The total GDP of these seven countries used to charge 67% of the world's GDP in 1992, but which has been the peak, but later it's like dropped year by year, and now it has become like 43% this year. So meanwhile, we can see that the growing power of China, with its own GDP charging 18% now. China has become a huge market, as we know, and the leading manufacturer which many countries are relying. As the global alliance and liberal democratic countries seeks to counter China, relying solely on the current G7 may no longer be sufficient anymore. Some countries outside the G7 have indeed already surpassed existing members in terms of industrial development or technological capabilities and economic performance. This all has led to growing discussions about whether to replace certain members or expand the group, make it bigger to include additional nations. South Korea, for instance, possesses advanced semiconductor and AI technologies, and is also the very major exporter of automobiles. And its per capita GDP has even surpassed that of Japan recently. And as a result, some argue that South Korea should be included into the group. And despite such proposals gaining traction, turning them into the reality might be very difficult, largely because they challenge the vested interest of the current G7 members, particularly Japan. And moreover, as the number of member states increases, the costs and the complexity of negotiations or having dialogues might be more. It might take more longer time and become more complicated. Something the existing members are likely reluctant to face.
Right, Chloe. A week from today, that will be next Tuesday, the annual NATO summit will take place in the Netherlands. Now, President Lee Jae-myung himself has yet to confirm whether or not he'll be attending that particular summit. What message might his presence or absence send to the rest of the world, do you think?
So I would say, first, NATO is more of a military cooperation. It's important to note that it's different from G7, and the message it might convey could be different from coming to the G7 summit, which President Lee Jae-myung decided to attend. Russia and China are excluded of the NATO, so that means, once again, that it would be more on the United States and Western side of the current division that's kind of plaguing the world at the moment. So it's obviously all hypothetical, and I do feel that whether President Lee Jae-myung comes or not, it would not probably the message would not probably be too strongly seen. But I would say that in the current context of tension between China and the United States and the Russian war in Ukraine, if the president decides to come to NATO summit, it would be a message towards the United States and showing that there is really, as he was saying, the backbone of South Korean diplomacy is the alliance with the United States, because he also has been criticized, Lee Jae-myung, on the will he be close enough to the US. That's something that's been said against him in the campaign. So that would be a strong message going to that direction. But on the other way, not going, would it be seen as a soothing gesture toward China and Russia? This is maybe not that simple. Could also be a way for South Korea to show a bit of independence, deciding not to align themselves completely with the United States. And in the same time, going there to NATO summit will probably also be a way to finally get that bilateral meeting with Donald Trump that unfortunately could not happen at the G7 summit. I would say it would also depend on the message that will be officially conveyed by the presidential office, whether he decides to go or not.
Right, because he has yet to make his decision. Of course, it has yet to be announced, and what we're talking about right now is just speculation. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time. Chloe, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Chien-Hao, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return with more panel discussion of the G7 summit, same time tomorrow. Join us then.